Well, thanks for having me today. It was a pleasure to drive the mountain pass out here. I had a meeting in Chehalis yesterday morning, and so I took the pass over and saw some of the most beautiful and countryside, or I guess mountain scenery I've ever seen, and also one of the more harrowing drives. So I'm happy to be here alive to talk about the minimum wage. Which is an exciting thing for me to talk about. It's the kind of thing I'm not allowed to talk about at the dinner table at home, and so I enjoy getting to events like this to talk about it. And it's on everyone's mind, especially in Washington State. There are the West Coast states, Washington, Oregon, and California, have sort of been either leading at the front or the back, sort of depending on your ideological perspective, but they've been doing experimental things with the minimum wage that are setting precedents in the worst way possible in terms of what businesses are going to have to adapt to. But it's also creating new things to study. It's creating new problems, new issues to address. And so I want to talk briefly about what's going on in the minimum wage, address some of the common arguments you might hear, and then open it up for a broader discussion. The Employment Policies Institute, just so everyone knows, our website, minimumwage.com, and then we have our main website is epionline.org. We're a nonprofit that's been around for 20 years, started by a guy named Rick Berman, and we do research on the minimum wage, and we also like to communicate aggressively on it. It's one of some enemies in the labor unions movement, but as many of you in the room, we wear that as a badge of honor. So here's the political and the public opinion environment on the minimum wage. So you may have seen that these headlines. At the beginning of the year, you had 20 states that raised their minimum wages. So now you have 29 states total around the country where the minimum wage is above the federal level of $7.25 an hour. You also have some cities now, obviously Seattle's a prominent example, but cities like Chicago, San Francisco, Sunnyvale, California, other cities that have decided to also raise their minimum wages even higher than the state level. So what this does right now is it changes the dynamic a little on the federal level. On the one hand, it actually takes a little bit of pressure off of Congress to act and to raise the federal minimum wage as President Obama would like to do, to take it up to $10.10. On the other hand, it means that there are fewer and fewer Republicans who will actually be affected by some sort of increase in the minimum wage. The average minimum wage right now around the country is about $8.30 an hour now. And so that means there are a lot of Republicans in Congress that could vote for at least $1 increase in the federal minimum wage without a lot of impact on their constituents because their state minimum wage is already higher. So the AFL-CIO actually tomorrow is holding its first annual national summit on raising wages and raising the minimum wage. They're holding it in Washington, D.C. The keynote speakers, Senator Elizabeth Warren and Labor Secretary Tom Perez. What they're trying to do here is they're trying to inject the minimum wage into the presidential discussion for 2016. They want to make sure that any candidate, whether it's Hillary Clinton or whoever else, that they're going to put the minimum wage and they're going to put wage inequality issues as a sort of a key portion of their presidential platform. The other idea is to actually put some pressure on Republicans to embrace this. I mean, if you look at people like Jeb Bush, who's now considered a front runner, he's got a brother and a father who both signed minimum wage increases when they were president. And so it's not beyond the pale to think that a Republican could actually try and embrace this issue to take it off the table, as it were, as an election issue. And so here's what's happening, though, right? As the federal minimum wage discussion, as Republicans in control of both houses, as some of the attention fades on the federal level, what we're seeing is the minimum wage move to the city level. Activist groups have realized that it's a lot easier to, count to 9 on a city council, than it is to count to a couple hundred in Congress or to count to a couple hundred in a state legislature. And there are two factors that are sort of driving a lot of this attention, right? So you have if you look at the job numbers each month, you're seeing a lot of growth in service industry jobs. You're also seeing a lot of focus from guys like this, your own Nick Hanauer here from Seattle, focusing on issues like inequality, right? There are a lot of people who are making a lot of money. There are some other folks who are working in these service industry jobs who aren't making as much money, and so there's this tension between the haves and the have-nots that people are exploiting, I think, in a way that we haven't seen in quite a while. So that's just kind of a quick overview. So I want to walk through a couple of common arguments here that you may have heard about raising the minimum wage. I could have done 40 slides on this, because it seems like for every argument you knock down, there's another one that they come up with. But I wanted to put some of the most common ones up here, just so you understand that the intellectual foundation for the case for a higher minimum wage really isn't that strong. So this is the first one we hear, that you can raise the minimum wage and that there's not going to be any job loss. This is an argument that even the President of the United States has embraced in his State of the Union address. We hear lots of state and local legislators repeat this, pointing to a handful of outlying studies that suggest this is the case. And so I'd like to suggest three things in terms of how you respond to that. Now, the first is this. Over the last 20 years, the minimum wage has been studied an incredible amount. Economists, this is one of the most studied issues in labor economics. And it's absolutely true that there are some studies out there that show that when you raise the minimum wage, if a state raises its minimum wage by 10%, that there was a minimal impact on employment. But the vast majority of the research, 85% of the best studies from that 20-year period, do point to job loss. And so we sort of did a visual representation of this just to give you a sense of what the consensus actually looks like. I mean, there are probably still some people out there that believe the earth is flat too, but that doesn't mean that just because you can find a couple studies that say that's what the consensus is. So that's kind of step one, the research response. Step two, and I don't know if you can see this or not, but step two for us has been pointing out to people areas in their own life where they're actually seeing the impact of a higher minimum wage. This is a billboard we did in San Francisco, and it basically says, "San Francisco, meet the new minimum wage employee." And it's someone typing on an iPad, and it says, "Hello, can I take your order?" We've found that, especially when interacting with members of the media, that pointing out that you can go into a grocery store now and bag your own groceries and check yourself out at a cash register, that you can go into restaurants now and place your order via a tablet-style device that dramatically reduces the need for service staff. These are ways that kind of help get beyond the battle of the studies. Reporters are getting emails all day long, from both sides saying, "Read my study, read my study." This is a really tangible way for something people have experienced in their own life that says, here's how a minimum wage increase causes job loss. And that brings us to the last step, I think, in responding to the job loss argument, which is the personal stories. This is a restaurant, or a former restaurant in Hillsdale, Michigan, called Tastes of Life. The timing of this conference ended up being fortuitous. We had a piece we'd been working on for the Wall Street Journal that hit yesterday that basically told the story of Tastes of Life, how it was a nonprofit restaurant in Michigan that actually went out of business after the state increased its minimum wage in the fall of last year. She had 12 people who lost their jobs, including people who had been formerly incarcerated, folks who had health issues, people who were struggling with addiction, people who really, this was the sort of the job of last resort for them. This was the person who would take a chance on them when no one else did. And so they're out of work now, and they don't have the same opportunity they did before. And I think having these stories is incredibly important to back up the studies, because it really puts, I think, an emotional point on the argument you're making. And we'll talk about that again in a minute, I think, as it relates to Seattle. So that's the job loss argument, right? That's the one we hear the most often. It's not going to cause job loss. Here's a couple others you might have heard, though. You might have heard that the minimum wage is not properly indexed for inflation. That if back in 1968, if the minimum wage had been linked to inflation since then, it'd be over $10 an hour today. So really, at $7.25, we're behind where they were in the late 1960s. So just to give you an example of why this is such a specious argument, it's kind of what they've done is they've cherry-picked the year. They basically found the historically anomaly, the one year where the minimum wage kind of hit that $10 high water mark, and they've picked that as what the historical value of the minimum wage should be. But let's look at some other years. Let's look at the year the minimum wage was created in 1938. If it had been linked to inflation since 1938, it would be $4.19 an hour today. How about 1948? It would be just about $4 an hour today. 1988, it'd be about $6.50 today. Even 1996, before it went up during the Clinton years, $7.15 an hour today. The point is that you can really pick any number of years that basically show that a minimum wage today is actually quite a bit higher than it would have been historically. And I think 1938 is the most sort of intellectually consistent version of that. But I think what it shows is just that when someone comes at you with this 1968 argument, they're not trying to really make a historical argument. All they're trying to do is cherry pick a year to back up the number that they'd like the minimum wage to be. So here's another one. This is a favorite of Senator Elizabeth Warren. I think it's one people heard a lot in Seattle during the debate over a $15 minimum wage, that the minimum wage has not been reflective of economy-wide gains in productivity, right? We've got these cell phones in our pockets, the economy is more productive than it's ever been, and people's wages, the minimum wage isn't keeping up. And so what I'd suggest to you, though, is that the productivity in the industries that are affected by a higher minimum wage looks quite a bit different than it does economy-wide. And I mapped it out here for just a 20-year period so you can see it. You got, all industries, and then you got the food service industry, right? Because, you can only clean a table, you can only cook a burger so fast. And so suggesting that the minimum wage should be linked to economy-wide productivity when that's what it looks like in food service doesn't really make a lot of sense. So just the last one to sort of address here, and like I said, there are any number of others I'd be happy to talk to you about offline, but is that large corporations can afford to pay more, and that's who's doing most of the hiring of minimum wage employees. We can have an argument about whether a company, a large corporation, whether the economics of a large corporation do permit them to pay a $10 minimum wage. I think there's a good case to say that they really don't. But let's look at actually who's doing the hiring, right? I know this chart's kind of small, but basically the key thing is that column on the far left-hand side, those are businesses with 100 or fewer employees. And so just about half the minimum wage workforce actually works for businesses with 100 or fewer employees. That is the biggest hirer of people who work at or near the minimum wage. It's your local diner, it's your local franchisee, it's the local grocery store. This is why when the minimum wage goes up, you do tend to see dramatic employment effects, because that's who's hurt. It's Taste of Life. It's a restaurant, that restaurant in Michigan that had 12 people. So the large corporation thing, they make a really good villain, but if you actually look at the numbers of where people are working, it doesn't work out logically. So just wanted to leave you with a couple of closing thoughts on Seattle, because Seattle and Washington State, you all are going to be the focal point now for whether $15 an hour is sustainable. And here's what you're going to be seeing soon. So this is after San Jose passed its minimum wage, a minimum wage increase from $8 to $10 in 2013. A year afterwards, the people who did it looked at the citywide economic growth and found that San Jose had not fallen off the map, that the city had continued to grow thanks to the tech industry. And so they declared the minimum wage increase a success. In San Francisco, they compared San Francisco to surrounding counties and said, well, San Francisco continues to grow faster than surrounding counties, so the minimum wage increase in San Francisco really must not have hurt. It's a little bit of sleight of hand where you say, well, because the city continues to grow, that means the minimum wage must not have hurt. But that's exactly the kind of argument that you're going to start hearing in Seattle. You're going to have dynamic industries that are going to continue to drive Seattle's growth. Even if the restaurant industry, even if service industries are being hurt, a lot of those things aren't going to show up in overall job growth numbers. And so what proponents are going to do, a year from now, you can set your watch to it, is they're going to start coming out with papers that suggest that the $15 minimum wage in Seattle has been a success. And you're going to have things like this too. This is, I think, all those of us who were thinking about the impact of a $15 minimum wage, you see headlines like this out of SeaTac where you have a gentleman, bless his heart, who owns a hotel and decides SeaTac passes a $15 minimum wage. He's going to go ahead and he's going to do that expansion anyway. This is one example that ricocheted across the country. This was a national news story. I had reporters from like the New York Times calling me about this, asking, well, hey, doesn't this prove that a $15 minimum wage doesn't hurt after all? We can talk all day about the caveats in SeaTac's law and whether it really is binding for businesses like this, But this kind of story is the kind of thing that convinces people that a $15 minimum wage is not the job killer that we've claimed it would be. And so if I was creating a to-do list for Seattle, here's what I'd say. And this is something that, we're involved in doing some of this too. The first is documenting consequences. The law comes online in the spring of this year. And so I think if you are interested in being able to prove to other cities around the state of Washington, to a Tacoma, to Olympia, why a $15 minimum wage is not a good idea, the stories of what steps restaurant owners take, what steps grocery stores take to adapt to a higher minimum wage, they have to be collected. Those stories are out there. I know they're out there because I've talked to those businesses. And so they have to be collected, and then they have to be popularized. Because unless those stories are told, the narrative that's going to dominate is the one I just showed you a minute ago. It's going to be Seattle as a city continues to grow, and that means a $15 minimum wage doesn't just work here, but it works in Tacoma, it works in Olympia, and maybe eventually it works statewide. So I think that is sort of, in terms of setting an agenda on the minimum wage, that has to be, I think, one of the top priorities in terms of figuring out what actually happened in Seattle. So I'm just going to leave you with one quick video here to give you a sense of when you have a story on the minimum wage, how you can use that to tell a story that really gets away from the big business narrative and instead gets to the emotional impact of who's actually working these jobs and who's actually hurt if those jobs go away.
Before coming to the Doe Fund, I was incarcerated.
I spent the last 20 years of my life in prison.
If I wasn't here, I would probably be like dead or in jail.
The Doe Fund was started at the height of the homeless crisis in New York. We've always believed in the basic principles that America is built on. Hard work, personal responsibility. People need to learn the soft skills of how to go to work, of being responsible, of showing up, of getting educated. You can't do that if jobs don't exist. The perception from those of us who work with the poorest people is that if you raise the minimum wage, businesses will not hire people. There is nothing we can afford less in America, nothing, than less jobs and less opportunity.
Raising the minimum wage hurts those who are most in need. Find out more online.
So with that, I'll conclude my presentation. And like I said, afterwards, I'd be happy to take any questions or answer them here.
For me, minimum wage and, through all the discussions that we had in Seattle, minimum wage should be a starting wage. It is a wage that allows employers to hire especially in my industry, to hire unskilled workers, to hire immigrants, to hire people that, like the Doe Fund, do not have a chance to get into the workforce, to allow our children a summer job, college students a part-time job while they are in transition in class. And so minimum wage for me shouldn't be thought of as a living wage. As an employer, I think we all have a responsibility towards our staff and our employees, and especially within our company, we really foster an environment where we want our employee to grow with us, to be able to sustain their families, to have a living wage for their family, to support their family. But that does not come with just automatically giving them a raise when they first join the company. It's working with them, educating with them to give them the experience. I've been in business for 13 years with my company. I've had several companies prior to that, but the Fuzzy Glow Cafe today has been in business for 13 years. And I would proudly say that about 70% of my staff have been with me on a minimum of 7 years. And that's an environment that we foster within our company. And I think most employers are responsible employers that want, especially small business, because we work on a family structure, a family environment. So we want to foster that relationship with our employees so that they can grow with us and they can grow with our company. So minimum wage, to kind of just group everyone into a group and say that, and force employers to pay a wage that they cannot afford to, is not economically sound, it's irresponsible, and I think it's going to have detrimental effect on the whole economy.
Great.
Thank you.
So I basically agree with that. Minimum wage was meant to be an introductory wage. I think all of us in this room can remember the first wage we earned. I remember getting paid less than $1 an hour to work, and $8 a day was pretty good. And I remember when I got a raise and it went up to $10 a day, I thought I was rich. But it's not meant to be the living wage that people describe it today. If we're really talking about a living wage, $15 doesn't do it in Seattle. So there is no way that companies like Starbucks or companies in the fast food industry can afford to pay those kind of wages and have customers coming into their stores. There certainly will be a change in the business structure if we try to get it to the so-called living wage. So we've had a battle royal in Seattle over this issue, and I've been at a company I was there for 21 years, and Starbucks actually never paid minimum wage ever. We always paid more than minimum wage. And we also gave health care benefits to everybody. But lo and behold, every time you come into a Starbucks store, it's in that cup of coffee. If you remember, it used to be a cup of coffee you could buy for 50 cents. And when I started at Starbucks, we were selling coffee for $1.25, and of course it's a lot more expensive than that today. But there is a point in time where the marketplace runs out of room, where customers are going to start rejecting. And Starbucks has had to use every means available to try to lower its cost and gain productivity. And we've done it primarily by automation. The espresso machines that you see in the store today are totally different than the ones that we had at the beginning. Now basically we can push a button. So one of the things that it did was cut back on a lot of the training that we had to do because we had obviously so much turnover. But the minimum wage argument doesn't hold up. We hear it everywhere. I open stores in 47 countries around the world. Okay, and I've seen every minimum wage concept available, I think, to humankind. And there are many countries that don't have minimum wage, such as Germany. Australia supposedly has the highest minimum wage in the world, but now Seattle will have usurped that in terms of buying power with that minimum wage. So how it's going to work in Seattle, I have no idea, but we're going to see.
We are the great guinea pig in this experiment. Michael, if you could just comment on this, and also because you have written extensively about it, if you could sort of continue the point that Howard just made as it relates to automation, because as you pointed out in your billboard that you ran in San Francisco, and as I know that you've written about quite frequently, one of the unintended consequences is a move towards automation.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think actually if you look at, the country of France is a great example. In France right now, the minimum wage is roughly $12 an hour U.S., give or take. And what companies like McDonald's did in France, and they actually did this, I think, 2 or 3 years ago now, is at 6,000 locations in Western Europe, they actually made the decision to stop hiring cashiers and instead have customers place their order via sort of a touch screen module now, and they're trying to introduce it in the United States now, sort of via a different method. It's sort of a sandwich customization station, so sort of being marketed as kind of more of a high-end alternative for customers. But the end result is the same, which is really that the opportunities that used to be available for young people there aren't anymore. And in an environment where you have unemployment rates for young adults, I mean, in Washington State, I think it's still about 28% unemployment for 16 to 19-year-olds. These are not the kind of transitions you want to be accelerating. I do think, and we may get into this later, I do think that on the question of employer responsibility and the idea of a living wage, I think opponents of a higher minimum wage, it's always incumbent upon people who are opposed to it, I think, to be careful in how you talk about it, because there are a lot of lives impacted by it. The good news is that there are better policy alternatives, too, than raising the minimum wage. And so I don't think you necessarily just have to be opposed with no alternative. There are things that you can propose as a better way.
I'd like to add to that. I think that all of us are business people, and being a business person in a community means that we have responsibilities to our community. And if all we are is against something, then all we are always doing is reacting to something somebody else proposes. And I think it behooves the business community to get out in front of this and do the things that you're talking about, which is take charge of the discussion instead of being at the other end of the whip and getting whipped around by the forces in the marketplace. And that requires that we come together as a group, as business leaders across the state, and that we demand that the institutions that represent us, whether it's this organization or whether the Association of Washington Businesses or the chambers, do something. And we have to have a plan. If we don't have a plan, I guarantee you others will have a plan. And if you want to find out about a plan, this is a book written by a guy named Andy Stern, and Andy Stern was the founder of the Service Employees Union. And in this book represents the plan that the Service Employees Union is following. And if you read this book, you'll find out exactly what was going to happen in Seattle. And I wish more of us would have read it before, because everything that happened in Seattle and SeaTac was in this book, and he's planning it, and it's going forward from here. So we have to take charge of our own destiny. We can't let other people take charge of our destiny for us.
So, Michael, you sort of touched on a question I was going to ask later, but since you brought it up, if we could go ahead and tackle that right now. Alternatives, alternative policies. Will minimum wage, does increasing the minimum wage actually help lift families out of poverty? Is it the best way to address the issue of poverty, and what are some of the, might be better alternatives?
Yeah, so, yeah, one of the, other than the minimum wage debate tends to get defined by the issue of whether or not it causes lost jobs, and that's an important issue, but I think that the more important policy question is actually whether it delivers the goods to people in poverty. And this issue has been studied extensively as well, and you actually find that it really doesn't reduce poverty that much. There used to be a really strong relationship between being a minimum wage worker and living in a family below the poverty line. Today, that's kind of flipped, and so most minimum wage workers actually don't live in poor families, and so target efficiency, which is this term economists like to throw around, the minimum wage has terrible target efficiency. Now, if that was the worst drawback to raising a minimum wage, it still might be a good idea, but obviously the job loss thing factors in as well. So in terms of better alternatives, something we talk about a lot in terms of reducing poverty is the earned income tax credit. It operates a lot like a boost to your paycheck, essentially, but it works through the tax code instead of through a mandate on employers. I've been thrilled to see Republicans like Paul Ryan get out in front of expanding it for single adults. There was a faction of the Republican Party that had voiced some opposition to expansion in the earned income tax credit, and I hope they've moved away from that. Other things the business community can look at, though, and I think Howard's exactly right, that there are legislative alternatives to just raising the minimum wage. I mean, if you think about some of the issues that the Seattle debate factored around in terms of tip income and things like that, you have tipped employees right now who are earning $13, $14, $15 an hour at least with tip income included. And so especially in some of these local battles and local debates, I think there are ways that employers can think about how can we hit the number that the activists are trying to get at, but maybe do so in a way that doesn't adversely affect our business model, doesn't force us to raise prices, and is actually good for the employee, good for the customer, good for the business. I mean, those debates tend to be more salient sometimes in urban areas where you're negotiating with a city council that is determined to do this thing come hell or high water. But the point is that there are alternatives both to reduce poverty and to make a minimum wage increase less harmful.
Thank you. And just to add to that, one fascinating statistic about this argument that you're going to lift families out of poverty by increasing the minimum wage is the sobering fact that 2/3 of adults who live in poverty don't work. So I think Michael is exactly right. Any policy that's aimed at lifting those folks out of poverty needs to center more on job creation rather than increasing a wage that the vast majority of them don't earn. So Taylor, I want to just kind of switch gears for a second and talk a little bit more about the personal side of increasing the minimum wage, Seattle's mandate for your business. Now, there's no arguing some workers may be better off. They're going to earn at some point $15 an hour. It's going to increase every year according to inflation. But what are the trade-offs to that $15 an hour wage, and are they worth it?
Trade-off is there's going to be, specifically for our company, we have 65 employees. We hire a lot of immigrants, new immigrants to the city. I would say that already about 65% of our staff are already making above the $15 minimum wage. The other are from mostly part-time students who are working during the summer or working during holidays, part-time jobs. And then the other is from new immigrants that are arriving in this country. And what we've already seen from our company and from other restaurants owners in our community is that there's going to be a gap or a loss of jobs for these new immigrants. So usually what happens is that if you're newly arrived in this country, most of the immigrants don't speak English. They have very little skills. They have no knowledge of the city, of the culture, of how to find a job. So typically what they will do is go to their friends and family and ask them if anyone who's hiring or if you can refer me for a job. And that's how most of the time, they are referred to us through friends, family, community. And when I hire someone like that, because they don't possess any skills, I don't let go of my existing employees. So we hire them and then we give them a job for at least 3 to 6 months of training. And whether it's to train with the health code, to train with machineries, how to operate, how to work. Our existing staff, take them under their wing and show them the bus routes, where they can drop off their kids at community centers for daycare. So when I am forced to pay $12, $15 an hour, the opportunities for these new immigrants is going to go away. There's not going to be a lot of doors open for them, because when I hire one immigrant and who do not have a lot of skills, then I need to hire 2 to do a job of one experienced person. But when there's a pool of $15 very well experienced line cooks or chefs or whatnot, then the opportunity most likely I would do is to hire the more experienced workers. So you're going to see a shift, and we've already froze our hiring for the period, not knowing what's going to happen in April. So we've already frozen that, and a lot of my colleagues as well. So now we're looking beyond the new immigrant to hire. So we're looking for more experienced people with this new minimum wage that's coming up. So you're going to see a shift where immigrants aren't going to be able to find jobs, aren't going to be able to get the life skills or the training that they need to get, start a work here in the U.S. or in any of the cities.
Great. Does anybody have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're going to see a loss of jobs. I can guarantee you almost without a doubt that within the next 3 to 5 years you will see iPads. You will walk into a Starbucks store. You won't be able to use cash, I bet. Now, nobody's told me that, but I'm guessing you will not be able to use cash. It'll only be credit cards or a Starbucks card or a debit card, because it'll be in the company's interest to not have to make change, and they'll be willing to give up some business for that. The second thing is, we talk about minimum wage as being the real issue, but when you think of what the SEIE is really doing, they don't really care that much about minimum wage. It's not their real issue. Their real issue is to drive up other wages, and that's what's going to take place. So let's take Seattle, $15 minimum, going up to $15 minimum wage. So if you're in the home health care business, forget the retail business or food service business, think about what that does. Now, home health care now charges between $18 and $22 an hour for somebody to go into somebody's home. That's going to have to go up to about $28 an hour just to maintain the same differential in terms of cost. Now, the good part about it, you in Eastern Washington are going to be able to pay for that for Seattleites, so we appreciate that. Because the state is going to have to make up that difference, right, in home health care costs because of the state laws. So it's going to be a real issue in Olympia, how they figure out how to do that. But there is going to be, young people will not be able to get a job. You're not, high school kids, they are going to be done. It will not happen. And if you want to find out how that worked, just look at the Australian numbers. The unemployment rate among kids below 19 or 18 years old is just horrendous, even ones with college experience, because you can't pay for inexperience. Will not have the money to train, just like Taylor is talking about, and those kind of jobs will go away. Immigrants, people that can't speak the language, they're not going to get employed. because they will not provide value add. And so the next thing that will happen is the state is going to come and say, gee, we have to spend money on training these people. So it'll be an ever-increasing spiral. And it isn't the $15 that's going to affect the jobs in our kind of industry, but how about all the light manufacturing jobs that are paying 17 now, or 18 or 20, and are going to have to go up because they're going to be saying, well, I can go to McDonald's and earn $15 an hour. Why aren't I making 25?
So as it relates to Seattle's $15 an hour minimum wage, I know a lot of business owners, folks in the business community, felt disenfranchised, if you will, with the process of how that $15 minimum wage came to be. One business representative on the mayor's committee that was tasked with exploring this wage, he called it a sham. So when in 1998, we put the issue of increasing our state's minimum wage was put to the voters via an initiative 688. It increased the state's minimum wage, tied it to inflation, and today we have the highest minimum wage of any state in the nation at $9.47 an hour. So while we're pushing for even higher minimum wages in these local jurisdictions, we also have these folks who are pushing for an increase at the state level to take us even further than the $9.47. Is increasing the state's minimum wage, is that an issue that should be decided by lawmakers, or should voters have the final say like they did back in 1998 with Initiative 668? Howard?
Well, just to give you just a little bit of history, this was jammed through by the Service Employees Union and a mayor that had just been elected in the city of Seattle, and our famous socialist council member. I call her the idiot savant, but not a nice way to call it, I bet. I mean it. So.
It's a term of endearment.
It's a term of endearment. And it got jammed through. And basically the union had the keys to the back door of City Hall, and they appointed a committee of a certain number of people, supposedly representative of the business community and the labor community, except the deck was stacked. Almost 3/4 of the people on the business side of the ledger, including the slide that you showed about the hotel adding more, spending more money on SeaTac. That hotel happens to be owned by Howard S. Wright, who owns the Space Needle in Seattle and is beholden to the city. And when we started the committee meetings, I went to the first big meeting, and I knew right away where this thing was going, because Howard was looking to gain agreement, and he didn't like any conflict in the discussion about what we should do. And so right out of the get-go, the mayor was in charge. The SEIU basically forced the city council, like they always do, the threat of withholding votes. And when we tried to push back on it, basically the mayor told us to butt out. And that if we didn't take what was on the table, it was going to get a lot worse. So do I believe that it should be enacted by the council or by state government? No. We should be able to vote on it so that we can put all the issues in front of the population and let the chips fall where they may. If it goes the other way, fine. But at least we'll have a chance to present our issues and present the facts from a business perspective. And if the state wants more jobs, which I'm not always sure about, and I particularly know that the SIU, they don't really like small business. As a matter of fact, one of the head labor leaders in the city of Seattle said we just as soon not have any small businesses because bigger businesses are easier to organize. And when you hear stuff like that, you understand what's really going on here.
Great. So my next question is, I've got time, I think, for one more panel question before we open it up for a couple minutes of Q&A with the audience. But Taylor, just kind of talking about what Howard was discussing and, the idea that it was jammed through in Seattle. I know one issue in particular was the idea of a training wage for teenagers, young workers, or a training wage in general for folks with no skills. What are your thoughts on a training wage? How would it help your business, and how did that sort of pan out in the Seattle debate?
Going back to what Howard said, that this was a process that a lot of us thought was a sham, that was put together quickly by the mayor, the task force, to address this issue. And a lot of the interested party were not at the table, including the minority business group. If you looked at the statistics for 2012, Seattle generated about $2 billion in sales from restaurants. And of that sector, the largest sector was 14%, and most of those sectors were owned by minority businesses. So we weren't invited to the table to talk about the issue or to discuss or how this is going to affect us. And when it got to the point where we literally had 300 small minority business owners, which you would rarely see, hold a summit to address the issue and invited the mayor and the city council to attend this summit. It was only 2 council members showed up. And so there was a really hard push from the community, not that we don't support a raise in minimum wage or a better living wage for our employees, but we thought that there are better ways and processes in which it can be done where it doesn't hurt small businesses. And 2 of the items that we push really hard with the mayor's office, city council, and with the task force that didn't get to be included in the ordinance. First is the training wage, because what we asked for is a 3 to 6 months training wage as part of the ordinance. I believe myself as well that the training wage will allow students, immigrants, and people at risk and people with no experience to get jobs in industries and in any industry, and it would open the door for these people to get jobs. And that training wage is a wage that would be paid at the current state minimum wage between 3 to 6 months. And then after that training wage period is over, then and the employee continues with the company, then they would be paid at the current rate of whatever Seattle is at that time. The other one that we also asked for is an exemption for micro business. So micro business is any business with less than 10 employees, because the dynamic of a small business with less than 10 employees, usually you find the husband and wife, their children, their family members, and they may have 2, 3, or 4 or 5 employees working at their place of business. So allowing these small exemptions for the micro business so that let the market dictate to them what they should be paying their employees. But again, it also opens the door for them to hire, to allow people without experience to be able to work at their place of business. So for example, my mother, who also owns her own restaurant, she's 62 years old, she's owned her restaurant since '93. Her income for 2013 was $24,000 after she paid everybody, her staff included. So for someone like her to now be dictated about how much she should be paying her employees next year, literally it would wipe out that $24,000 in earnings that she has. So as an employer creating 5 jobs in her business, what is she to do next year when the the rate increases? So either she has a choice of letting go more employees, which she already has, or closing down her restaurants after almost 20 years of being in business. So those are the 2 things, and this is a story, my mother's story is not any different from a lot of the other small businesses that we spoke to. So creating an exemption for the micro business will allow her to stay in business and, give her the chance to pay the employees a higher wage if that's what the market dictates, if she can't find employees, and then giving her the time and other employers the time to revamp their business or to do marketing efforts or to do what it is that needs to be done in order to increase their sales.
Great, thank you. And now I want to open it up for some questions from the audience if we have any. But before I do, I just want to make a quick comment. I know we're talking a lot about Seattle, and obviously we're not in Seattle, we're in the Tri-Cities, and you may be wondering why are we talking about Seattle? And the reason is because Seattle is really just sort of the incubator for bad public policy that inevitably spreads to the rest of the state. So it's really imperative that we look at Seattle, understand what happened, how it happened, and why it happened. And the movement is spreading. It's already been proposed, a ballot initiative in Tacoma. It will be coming soon to a city near you. And then there are lawmakers at the state level who have started to cry uncle and say, well, maybe we ought to think about passing a bill increasing the state minimum wage so that we can try to mitigate the impacts of a $15 minimum wage that's going to be coming city by city. So that's why we're really talking a lot about Seattle, because it's really sort of our little guinea pig under the microscope that we can look at as we ponder what's going to happen in the rest of the state. So with that, first question. Oh, yes.
I'm dying to ask this, or tell a little story about Mr. Behar, if I may, because I think it illustrates the difference between a lowest common denominator, minimum wage world, and what he and the other people at Starbucks have created. And since I met my husband at Starbucks 23 years ago, I will always have a soft spot. And back to your point about espresso machines, there was a fellow in Bellevue Starbucks, he gave you about 5 shots for the price of 1. It was just like, woohoo! Mercer Island Starbucks was opened up, and it opened a drive-through, and this is probably mid-90s?
Early 90s.
Early 90s. Starbucks was transitioning from loose tea in a $12 infuser, which a lot of people already either threw away or took, to tea bags. I found myself getting a refill of tea in that Mercer Island Starbucks line, and who was ahead of me but Howard? He turned to me and he said, "How are you liking the tea here? May I get you another cup?" Some ordinary middle-aged woman standing in line, not knowing she was standing behind an executive at Starbucks, who happens, I believe, to live on Mercer Island. He scampered behind the corner, or the counter, got me a refill on my tea and brought it back and asked me again. From that point on, whenever we went to that Mercer Island Starbucks, the manager treated us like royalty because she thought that we actually knew him and were somehow connected. And she said, "How do you know Howard?" And we said, "Howard who?" To me, that exemplifies the difference between paying $15 an hour to someone who really should be working for $6 an hour and working on their education so that immigrants and other peoples can start businesses. We also happened to see Howard in line at that same Starbucks at 5 a.m. one morning when we were going to work, and it wasn't yet open, and we felt sorry for the manager. But I think that's the kind of world that we're talking about, not lowest common denominator minimum wage world.
Thank you. Yes. Oh, if you could just wait for the microphone, that way TVW can.
I'm just curious, when your arguments, for me, and I think most of us, are sound and logical, what were the responses when you communicated what you just did to us, to the board or in the debate? What would they say? How could they argue against that? What was their reply?
You're talking about to the city council?
Or council, or perhaps another meeting you said you had two that came to your meeting.
The pushback is the same arguments that you hear here. That, well, the one I always heard was, well, Howard Schultz makes all this money, so, you know, it's corporate capitalist pigs, we're greedy, and we're holding wages down. So I ran a number once because I just wanted to know for myself. I said, okay, if the Section 16 officers, which are the top 6 officers, excuse me, the company gave up all their wages, all their stock options, all their health care and everything, how much could we increase wages for all our employees? It was 1 cent an hour. But yet you continue to hear that's the problem. It's not the problem. We may agree or disagree on whether CEOs get paid too much, you know, or too little, whatever you happen to feel, but it is not the problem. The problem we have is that nobody wants to face up to the facts that there are some jobs that are minimum wage jobs. That's been the nature of the world forever, and they will always be there. They're not going to go away, okay? Unless you're all willing to pay $5 for a head of lettuce, right? Or you're willing to pay what's going to happen at Starbucks. You know, the price right now, the average sale at Starbucks is about $5.25. To break even with the new $15 an hour labor rates, because Starbucks average probably is about $10.50 to somewhere between $10.50 and $11 plus benefits. But to break even, Starbucks is going to have to increase that average ticket to $6.25. So that's about a 20% increase and that just breaks it even. That gives you dollar for dollar back. So labor costs are going to go from somewhere around 28 to 30% to close to 37%. So you start to get into that kind of stratosphere on labor costs. When there's a downturn, all hell is going to break loose. And people don't think about it in those terms. We look at it now, $15, I get it now. There's no effect in the future, but it's the future where the problem is going to be. We're going to survive, but you're going to pay a lot more, I guarantee you, for everything you buy.
I had 2 closed-door meetings with union leaders during the debate, during the discussions, and basically, I brought up all the stories, I shared the stories, I asked for the exemptions, and their answer was that our fight is not with the small business. You guys just got caught in the crossfire, and basically that's too bad. And that was the answer. There were a few other people in the room with me, and we just said, I mean, one of them actually came out and said, I support small business, but I can't come out and say that. And you guys are just caught in the crossfires.
And if you believe they support small business, you know, we have a new tunnel to sell you in Seattle. It is not true. They don't. Okay, they do not. And anyway, in terms of retail, there is no difference between small business and big business. I want you to remember that. Beware of false gifts. When the legislature comes to you and says, gee, we're going to do something for small business, you're selling yourself down the road. A store is a store is a store is a store. Everything in retail and food service is about unit level economics. If one store works, maybe you can open two. If two works, you can open three. But if one doesn't work, you don't open any more. And that's the way it is. And so the profit, it's always on a per unit basis. So don't fall into that trap. And we have this law, or the rule in Seattle is going to be if you have more than 500 employees, you're going to be at the higher rate much sooner. The difference for Starbucks is $50,000 a year per store, which takes out probably over a third of the profits on a per store basis for those years that we're paying the extra amount. So it is not the right way to go. It's a ridiculous way to go, and you know, but there's nothing we can do. So let me. I made a note before I came here. So the big guys don't want the heat. You have to understand that. The Starbucks of this world, the McDonald's of this world, the big companies don't want the heat. They don't want to get caught in this trap of you're a bad guy, you're a bad CEO, you're greedy. And so they won't battle. And none of them did. Did you see Starbucks didn't do a thing? I can say I'm retired, so I can say that now. They didn't do anything, and I pushed them hard to do something, and they would not take it on. You look what happened to McDonald's. They were the bad guys, right? They went after McDonald's really heavily, and McDonald's was weak at that point in time and decided that they couldn't do anything. I talked to the CEO of McDonald's, and he said, there's just nothing we're going to do. We got to leave it alone. And that's what's going on. And the big companies and the big company CEOs don't want to take the heat in the press, and they don't want to take the heat in the marketplace. And unfortunately, it's going to be left to the small guys to deal with this.
Sure.
The one last thing I'll say, too, is that ultimately, it's not about the evidence, it's about ideology. And so you can have the most compelling research and stories in the world. And for a lot, you know, my boss likes to joke that, you know, you can't negotiate with the Kremlin. I mean, it's sort of like there are a lot of folks out there who want to do this for reasons other than the economic evidence. I mean, if you see what San Francisco just passed, it's a new law limiting when part-time employees, how you can hire part-time employees and how they can be scheduled. I mean, this is what's coming, and the reason these things are coming is not because the evidence says it's a good idea. It's for very different reasons.
Perfect. Well, with that, we are ready to wrap this panel up, and I want to, if you'll join me in thanking Michael, Howard, and Taylor. I think they all did a fantastic job.